Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome to the second half of the class, focusing on political behavior. This half is going to dive more into how people act in political systems, after our first half covered how political systems operate in and of themselves. First lecture today is on public opinion and political attitudes. Public opinion is a kind of subfield of political science, specifically American politics. It studies the masses and how they feel about things. It's a methodological issue as well as a theoretical issue, right? There are a lot of issues with democratic governance and representation that this goes into. So I'm really excited to dive into it. So let's dive into the reading review. I assigned two very foundational texts in political behavior in American politics. But a lot has happened in the scholarship since then, but they're still really important pieces, and I think that they're a good introduction, partly because they don't involve a ton of really complicated models, like some of the scholarship that we're going to talk about later in class, models as in empirical models. And I think that they're a really good introduction to how the average public engages with politics. I think this is a good way of dipping our toes into what we're going to talk about this second half of the class, and that is that it is shocking, perhaps alarming, and stupefying how little the average person knows or cares about politics, and how much their voices actually matter, whether that is not at all where it should, or way too much where they have no reason to actually care. What is Campbell talking about? You want to have your own opinion about things. And Campbell says people don't really have that. First, he says that party identification anchors political participation and behavior. This goes back to that stuff that we talked about in the Congress week. Everything is filtered through the lens of parties in the United States. It introduces this writing, this view, this thing called the Michigan model, which emphasizes psychological attachment to party as the central organizing principle in American politics. Party ID isn't just a label. You're not just holding a card that says I'm a Republican or I am a Democrat. It's an enduring identity learned early in your life that then shapes how individuals perceive candidates, issues, and events. Second, voters interpret information through partisan perceptual screens. What is a perceptual screen, as Campbell and friends talk about it? It's one of their main theoretical elements here. What is a perceptual screen? Yes, and this is kind of related to what they're talking about with perceptual screens. Its partisans interpret political information through a lens that reinforces existing loyalties, filtering what they see and believe. You have basically tinted glasses, that every single event that happens, every single issue that happens is colored by how you're seeing those events. Those lenses are tinted by the party. So a party can come in and say, all criminals are evil and deserve to die. And you then view that as a card-carrying member of the pro-death party as saying, well, you know, I saw a guy steal a tube of Burt's Bees at the CVS the other day. That's a crime, that's a criminal, and he deserves to die. That's a perceptual screen, a very aggressive version of one. I'm not saying any party is actually advocating that, but still. Finally, long-term attachments outweigh short-term issue considerations. This is the thing that I have a bone to pick with them a little bit, but short-term forces like economic conditions or campaign issues that come and go with each election cycle matter less than long-term loyalties like to a party or to some identity group. Which explained at the time, remember they're writing in 1960, the remarkable stability of American partisanship over time. Why might this not be true anymore? Do you guys, when you talk to people about politics, if you talk to people about politics, get the sense from them that everything they believe is incredibly concrete and static over time? They really know what their values and morals are. Or are you eventually able to get kind of a fingernail under what they're believing and see that you can twist it one way or the other if you bring up some factoid or some emotional appeal? right? You can have this impact on people by talking to them. And I'm not here to say that discourse is everything here, but part of it, and we're going to talk about this, is the rapid pace of media now, right? We get more and more media frames that transition people away from what they believed before and form new identities. It's also fragmented. We don't have a monoculture anymore. Does anyone know what I mean when I say a monoculture? Like, everybody reads the same books. Everybody listens to the same music. Everybody watches the same TV shows. Now everybody has their own personalized algorithm on their phone. Your TikTok might be full of brain rot. The other person's TikTok might be full of like home reno stuff. Another person's might be food porn, right? It's all different and individualized. There's no monoculture anymore. So when everybody is having the same kinds of things thrown at them, the only differences that we have are based on these inherited differences, right? Like, I inherited the Republican Party from my parents, so I'm going to be a Republican over time, and I'm going to tell them to vote, blah, 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 blah. Basically, just look at how, like, Eastern Kentucky has voted in the last couple elections. A long-term Democratic stronghold who, when Trump comes along, suddenly changes that, and since then they've been all over the map because they don't know what's good for them anymore. They don't believe that anyone's advocating for them anymore. They're not just going to keep voting Democrat because their great-grandparents were fans of the New Deal. That's going to change over time. Which kind of leads us into Converse. What's Converse saying here? Yeah. Political attitudes change over time. Up until the mid-1960s, this idea is that we've inherited these political beliefs. Sure, the American voter is radical, and Converse is a co-author on this piece. This radical idea that it's largely filtered through party and not, this traditional view of democracy. What makes that more shocking is that people don't have deeply held values. You can get that fingernail under what they believe and change it a little bit, pop the hood and move things around a little bit, right? He argued that most people don't think about politics ideologically. If you guys remember from the recorded lecture over fall break, America is not a very ideological society. We don't have a lot of isms that we actually subscribe to. We're very ideologically adverse. That is, they don't organize their issue positions along coherent principles like liberalism or conservatism. And this might be shocking to you guys too, because you hear, people talk about the Democrats and the Republicans. That's a very cringy way of viewing it, but like, people don't like each other in these parties, and they're very held to these parties, but these parties aren't very ideological, and even so, most people don't even care about these parties. Like, political scientists will sit in their ivory tower and talk about all this stuff all day, and politicians will do the same, and journalists will do the same, and pundits will do the same, but if you go out and touch grass and talk to the average person, they don't give a shit. They might have one or two deeply held beliefs about some issue, because maybe they have strong opinions about educational policy because their mom was a third-grade teacher, right? But do you think they really care about interest rates overall, unless they're about to buy a house? Do you think they care about foreign policy? No, not really. And so if somebody offers them a suggestion, they might take it or they might go away from it, but it's not going to last over a long time. Converse introduces the concept of belief system constraint, which is the degree to which attitudes on one issue predict attitudes on another. He takes kind of an elitist view. Finally, Converse's advance here is methodological. Think back to the second video that I told you guys to watch, where I talk about survey experiments and responses. He notes attitudinal instability through a very specific methodological mechanism, and that is the survey response. We're going to talk a lot about surveys today in class. The survey response. Basically, what he's doing is he's using the ANES, that's a form of data set, it's an American National Election Study, asking people the same questions over and over again over time. And they're asking the same people those same questions over and over again over time. And what they're doing is they're answering differently over time. So if I ask you, do you believe that ice cream should be free in 1960 whatever? And then in 1970 whatever, I ask you, do you believe that ice cream should be free? The same person is answering yes one of those times and no another time. And he says that shows they have limited conceptual understanding. You guys don't understand the policy enough to form a cogent opinion that is stable over time. Another way to frame this, and I talked about this in the recorded lecture, is the idea of sophisticated and unsophisticated voters. This is common terminology in the scholarship. Sophisticated voters are people who are informed, people who have these concrete opinions, people who are of the elite often, but they don't necessarily have to be. A sophisticated voter thinks through these things. An unsophisticated voter doesn't have the time, the willpower, or the interest to do this. He says that the unsophisticated voter does not have cogent opinions over time. That's a very mean way of viewing things. It is also one that is, in my view, kind of true. So today's lecture is going to introduce how scholars define and study this idea of public opinion as the voice of citizens in a democracy, the collective voice of citizens. We're going to examine how individual preferences become measurable, largely through survey responses, and how those measurements inform government action, and how opinion changes across time, context, and group. This lecture here is largely concerned with structure, what opinion is, how it's aggregated, and what it does in a representative system. The next lecture turns to process, the psychological mechanisms through which people interpret information to form those opinions. So we had foundations last week, we have structure today, and then we have process, how that works in practice on Thursday. So, what is public opinion? Well, public opinion represents the distribution of preferences across citizens on political issues, leaders, and institutions. When I say distribution, I want you to think of a scale where you have position A, position Z, and all the other positions between that, right? Public opinion then aggregates what this scale looks like. Say you only have 2 people over here who believe in position A. Maybe more people believe somewhere about position J, and then it falls off. Now, this is a normal distribution. Normal distribution looks like a bell, right? You can talk about quintiles and stuff. I don't really care about that in this. But an aggregate of political or public opinion might look something like this. It might be skewed one way or another, but this is how we measure it. And that's how people then arrive and say, well, you know, the majority of these people right here support position J, so we're going to go with position J and model policy off of position J. It's not a single will, but an aggregation of millions of individual voices. Opinion is expressed in many ways. It could be through an election result, through a poll, we'll talk about that, demonstrations and protests, letters to your Congress people, or even online activities. Believe it or not, Congress people will have people who monitor social media feeds to see what people are saying about something. And it constantly evolves as events, elites, and institutions change. It is dynamic, it is not static. In democratic theory, responsiveness to public opinion legitimizes government authority. We talked about this when we talked about the Supreme Court, right? The Supreme Court cares about legitimacy because it reflects public opinion, the public sentiment about them. So, democratic theory, responsiveness to public opinion legitimizes government authority. Officials derive their power from the consent of the governed, as measured through these expressions. Remember, the consent of the governed. This is John Locke. This is Thomas Jefferson. This is foundational stuff. Public opinion provides the feedback loop between the government and the governed, okay? When officials act in line with a prevailing opinion, say, you guys all want weed to be legalized. If they then went and legalized weed, they're acting in line with public opinion. When they act in line with public opinion, they're signaling responsiveness. We're listening to you. When they diverge, they then risk backlash or realignment. Backlash largely manifests itself through them then losing elections, right? And remember, elected officials are predominantly electorally motivated. They want to listen to people. because they're going to experience backlash otherwise. So, when this happens, it can authorize, constrain, or redirect policy, right? As we noted, when they listen to you, they're motivated by elections, but also this then allows them to funnel sentiment into a policy that the public likes. They act out on this policy, they enact this policy, then people will then vote for them because they see the policy reflects what they want. However, representation isn't mechanical. It depends on how political systems interpret and weigh the public's voice. It's filtered through institutions and elites. Think of what Converse says, right? Sure, he says that opinions are stable among the elite, but let's take it a step further. Elite opinions inform the public. Think about it this way. It's really hard for a member of Congress or the president to listen to everybody in the country to hear what they have to say. So they might listen to an interest group. Gun owners for the people. And gun owners for the people are gun owners for the people. They want to pass pro-gun legislation. So they say, well, we listened to the public, but that public is an interest group. That's them kind of getting some idea of what public opinion is, but through a very skewed way. It's very opaque and hard to get at. This is a town hall. That's another way that they can get at public opinion. A member of Congress might hold a town hall. Unless they're Republican, then they don't hold town halls anymore. They might sit and listen to what the public has to say and then act on it. What I do want to note here is, remember I assigned E.E. Schattschneider for you guys to read a little while ago? Schattschneider has this famous quote where he says, "The flaw in pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent." That's douchebag, basically, for democracy is democracy for the rich, right? People who can voice their opinion tend to be wealthy. People who are listened to tend to be wealthy. That's how it works. So there are components to attitudes. Attitudes are multidimensional. Attitudes are kind of sentiments about politics, okay? First, you have cognitive components. They involve beliefs about facts. Say, whether you believe that immigration causes crime to increase. That is a thought that you have about something that informs a belief. The affective component reflects emotion. That could be whether or not immigration then makes you fearful or angry, or maybe immigration makes you proud. And then you attach that emotion to the belief about that issue. That then informs the evaluative element, and that combines belief and feeling into a judgment. For example, if you believe that immigration causes crime, and this makes you fearful and angry, you then might make the judgment that immigration policy should be stricter. Does this process make sense? It's relatively straightforward. Great. Distinguishing between these components is important in the literature, though, because it helps us understand why two people who agree on a fact might still differ on a policy or on politics. It's because they might feel differently about that fact or evaluate it differently. If we have a shared fact that immigration is rising, just as a base level, immigration is rising, how someone feels about that means that they might disagree with me. Say, I'm like, oh, that's great. We're going to get more workers in that are cheaper, and we're going to increase our economy. And some people say, well, that's at the cost of American laborers, and we're disagreeing on that, even though the base fact is the same. So the systematic study of public opinion became possible because of scientific polling, adapting the scientific method to get the opinions of people en masse. Surveys use random sampling to inform preferences about the larger population. What is random sampling? Yeah, you do it impartially. It's not informed. So like, say my whole population is everyone in this room, right? I give you all a number. I throw those numbers into a random number generator, and 10 of you come out randomly, and it's perfectly impartial. That's random sampling, right? In terms of polling, right, I might have 4,000 phone numbers that I call, and I pick 1,000 of them at random to call the survey, right? And that's the idea is then that we get a kind of mass view that is not partial or skewed one way. This is in an ideal world. This doesn't actually work out this way, but random sampling allows us to do this. Measurement is fragile, though. Wording, response options, and ordering of questions all influence answers. So let's talk about wording first. If I ask you, do you think that Donald Trump is doing a good job as president? Yes or no? That's going to elicit a different response than if I ask, how good of a job do you think Donald Trump is doing as president? One of them is a matter of degrees, one of them is a flat yes or no. If I ask you, do you think that immigrants cause crime? That's going to elicit a different response than if I ask you, how much crime do you think immigrants cause? One of them biases your result from the beginning. If we talk about order of questions, if I start with a question that says, do you believe that immigrants cause crime? And then the next question is, would you support an immigrant moving in next to you? You're already primed to think about immigrants and crime in the same kind of way. You're already thinking about them together. So you might be less likely then to answer, yeah, I want an immigrant to move in next to me, if you already are associating them with crime, versus if I ask first, would you be okay with an immigrant moving in next to you? And then second ask, do you believe that immigrants cause crime? Does that make sense? Overall, aggregation across polls and time mitigates noise and reveals durable patterns such as partisan realignments or shifting policy priorities. When I say noise, I mean outliers. So say someone says, like, one of the questions is, how intrusive into your life should tax policy be, right? Like, do you support redistribution of wealth versus we should have no taxes whatsoever? And one guy's like, we should abolish the government entirely. That's noise. That's an outlier. This here is an example of perhaps the most accessible and common form of survey response in public opinion, and that is an approval poll. I just got this off of CNN like 3 days ago. I think this is updated, and it's just the percent who say approve versus disapprove in CNN's poll of polls, whether or not they approve or disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing. And you can see it track from fairly even at the beginning of his second term to a pretty widespread 41 approve, 57 disapprove by early October, I think was the last, the 5th of October is the last time that was updated. The structure of public opinion. The structure of opinion reflects how individuals organize their view. Some citizens rely on ideology, others rely on identity and partisan cues. Very few people rely on ideology. By that I mean, someone might form their opinions because they are a staunch communist. They believe in the rights of the worker. They believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat and overthrowing the bourgeoisie and taking over America from the capitalist pigs who run it and giving back the power to the workers and not alienating them from the means of production. That is an ideological way of viewing their opinions. Other people might structure it by identity. Someone might say, I'm a member of the queer community, and historically, the Democrats have been on the side of the queer community, so I'm going to support them in an election. Some of it might be from party. I'm a Republican. I vote Republican. That's kind of how that works. Constraint varies across citizens. So remember when I had this kind of hierarchical model right here, where we had different forms of attitudinal constraint? That also varies horizontally too. Even among us peons, some of us might have different attitudinal constraint than others. Some of us might be fine with the status quo and not really care, not really dive that deeply into it. And some of us, working the same job or being the same student at the same university or the same type of student, really will care about it. That's going to change from person to person. Elite discourse shapes these structures by linking issues together. For example, elites have tried very hard to link certain issues with certain beliefs. Linking environmentalism to liberalism was a large push by both the oil lobby, as well as the Republican Party, to make it potentially a bit cringe to be an environmentalist. And the literature distinguishes between consensus issues, where opinions are broadly shared. Most people in America support the idea of democracy in a broad sense, versus dissensus issues, which divide the electorate. Abortion, for one. People can't agree on abortion. I'm talking about it since, I don't know, the time of the Torah, and we're still, I don't know, guys. You get the difference between consensus and dissensus? Things that unite us, things that divide us. Great. So, fun fact, opinion changes over time. It is fluid, it is not it is dynamic. Major events like economic crises, wars, and social movements reshape attitudes, especially during youth and early adulthood, where you inherit your partisan attachments or beliefs. I know you guys might like to think that you are a perfect, beautiful little butterfly and have your own thoughts about things, and you're special because, you know, you listened to an Elliott Smith album once and it made you cry like nothing else, and now you see the world or whatever. But, like, most of your beliefs are predicated on what your parents thought, whether that's agreeing with them or disagreeing with them. Sorry, it's all your parents' fault. This extends also to cohorts, right? So generations form distinct beliefs based on distinct contexts. So take the generation that was raised during the Great Depression. They have very different views about the economy than perhaps the generation during the Vietnam War, or the generation that was really inspired by the Reagan Revolution, or during the gay 90s, or after 9/11. Those people were kind of screwed up. And then you guys, sorry to say it, but you guys got fucked by the COVID pandemic. Believe it or not, that has influenced your entire generation's beliefs about politics as well, in very divisive ways, but you guys will be known as the COVID generation. I'm sorry, at least to political scientists. Issue salience rises and falls over time. Salience is how much people care about an issue, how much they pay attention to it, how much they really want to hear about it. This here is a figure, it's from a paper in a U Chicago Press journal, so I guess HAPS. I don't know for certain. I put this on here months ago, but it shows how much people are caring about the issues immigration, economy, and crime over time, what they're rating as a top issue that they care about, and these are percentages over here ranging from 0 to 70%. And as you see, for example, let's track the economy. People cared a lot about it over the early 2000s, and they cared less about it, and then the 2008 financial crisis hits, and people really care about it again, then it falls down, and if we extended this into the modern day, people would care about it a lot again because everything's really expensive. Any questions about issue salience? Oh, did someone have a question? Oh, someone just sneezed. Okay. And there is a feedback between policy and public opinion. We'll get into that a little bit later. Government actions alter conditions, and thus the evaluations that citizens make. So, policy informs opinion, opinion then informs policy. It's a circle. I'm going to talk about 2 books today during class. This is not the one I would recommend. I hate this book, but it's important. So, collective opinion and aggregation. Since while individual opinions may be unstable, collective opinion displays remarkable regularity. So, you might wake up on a Thursday and believe one thing and wake up on a Friday and believe something else. But if I surveyed all of you together on that Thursday and then that Friday, the opinion would probably look exactly the same between the two of them. Random noise tends to cancel out in aggregate opinion, revealing systematic responses to real-world trends. People tend to respond rationally in aggregate to economic growth, inflation, foreign conflict, big events. Scholars describe this as thermostatic opinion. When policy shifts to the left, the public generally will kind of shift to the right a little bit because they don't like quick change, and vice versa. Aggregate opinion thus acts as a stabilizing feedback mechanism, aligning long-term government output with majority preferences. This is what's called macro politics. Macro level stability underpins confidence in democratic responsiveness despite individual volatility. This is really dense to talk about, so I'm going to draw another little picture over here. So, when I talk about noise, we're going to take this out of the realm of public opinion for a second, right? So, I have a coordinate plane. We have our x-axis and our y-axis. If I am sampling only 2 data points, it's really hard to draw a trend line between them with any degree of confidence. So if I'm drawing a trend line between this, it looks something like this, right? But how confident are we in being able to say that x causes y in this when we only have 2 observations? Not very confident. Okay. Say this is one person and this is another person. Reviewing their beliefs on some policy, right? This is, say, percentage of support for policy Y, okay? Or this is percentage of support for the policy. And then we again have policy distribution from A to Z here with all of the letters in between, right? Policy A, kill everyone. Policy Z, nobody ever dies. Okay? 2 differing ideas, right? When we start to get a lot more observations in here, a lot of different people's beliefs, we have a lot more going on down here. We can be a lot more confident to say that the true trend line between them is this way. Macro politics does the same thing as this does in statistics, right? When you have a lot of people that you are sampling about a particular issue, you can be much more confident about what the aggregate political sentiment is than if you sample fewer people. It's a pretty simple idea. At the same time, the aggregate effect of having more people is moderating. Macro politics tends to moderate because there are fewer people at the far left and the far right than we would believe. Again, that's what we're talking about. When a policy moves too far to the left, macro politics tends to move to the right in reaction. If you have more people in macro politics, it moderates. This is really complicated stuff that I'm trying to explain very simply. Does this make sense? Great. There's probably only going to be one question on the final about this, so 5 minutes of your life wasted. Don't read this book. Worst book I read in grad school. So, we're going back to institutions, guys. But we're done with institutions. No, we're not. We never leave institutions. Public opinion interacts differently with each branch of government. Elections obviously translate into preferences, which then those preferences translate into representation, but institutional features such as districts, gerrymandering, and the like, Senate apportionment, or Senate appointment, and the Electoral College, these distort responsiveness. Think about it in terms of gerrymandering, right? Remember that figure that I showed how to steal an election? And it was how to get a majority or a minority red area all represented by red folks. That's how the institutions can change responsiveness and interpretation of public opinion. Federalism fragments public into multiple constituencies, creating variations across states. Maybe your opinion about an issue as a resident of the state of South Carolina is different than your opinion about an issue as a resident of the United States. Maybe you have strong opinions about educational policy insofar as it relates to the state's job in education, but you are strongly opposed to federal interference even though you want to expand educational access in your state. Those are not mutually exclusive opinions. You just have a different opinion based on the constituency that you are a part of in that moment. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Courts and the bureaucracy are insulated from direct opinion, but they still track legitimacy signals. Go back to the video on why the courts cares about legitimacy to go to this, right? Because they are unelected, they don't necessarily have these same cues of elections, the largest cue of public sentiment, but they still care about what people believe about them. And as I noted, interest groups amplify some voices. Money in politics is a thing. Interest groups are able to funnel the voices of perhaps some minority groups, whether that be for the good or for the ill, into the ears of your elected representatives, and then they can influence policy. The media obviously plays a role here. Media are central intermediaries between citizens and politics. Agenda setting research shows that the issues most covered become those that the public deems important. So, if the media pays a lot of attention to one issue, people are generally going to think it's important. Priming occurs when coverage emphasizes certain criteria, say the economy, affecting how citizens judge leaders. So, priming, the coverage decides to emphasize the economic effects of the government shutdown. That's going to influence how people talk about it versus the layoffs, specific layoffs in the education department. There's also framing. Framing influences how people interpret events, highlighting particular causes or consequences. Priming is what they're focusing on. Framing is how the media is focusing on it. And obviously, media environment influences polarization. I talked about echo chambers a little bit. Because we don't have a monoculture anymore, because everybody has a personalized algorithm, it's much easier for us just to fall into listening to the same voices over time, and those voices listen to each other, and then everybody is believing the same thing in that world, which is very different from everybody believing the same thing in a different world. Somewhat related to this, I'm going to actually make a book recommendation. It just came out this year. This book, Algospeak, by Adam Alexi, otherwise known as Etymology Nerd on TikTok. You might have seen him. He does this beautiful job talking about how language of political movements actually influences how different people talk and believe certain things about politics. I would highly recommend that you check it out. It's very good. So, causality runs both ways when it comes to public opinion. Policy shapes public opinion, but public opinion also shapes policy and vice versa. Think about the Ouroboros eating its tail, for those literature nerds out there. When citizens experience tangible benefits from a policy, money in their pocket from a social security check, or healthcare coverage through Obamacare, they develop attachments to those programs. On the other side, visible costs or failures generate backlash. If there is a massive boondoggle of some policy, think of the United States interference in Afghanistan, right? It destroyed the imperial presidency. People are not a fan of intervention in foreign wars. They used to be, believe it or not. Look at news coverage after 9/11. Everybody wanted to bomb everybody. Visibility and attribution matter. Whether people attribute outcomes to the government determines if policy builds or erodes trust. If the government effectively can say, we did this good policy, then that policy can continue on. If they can't and they're bad at communicating, like a certain president who rhymes with Bo Jiden, then it fails. This creates self-reinforcing political cycles. It basically means that politics is iterative. Each policy decision modifies the context in which future opinions form. Visual representation of it is this figure. We start here. People have a problem. They then feel mistreated, and they go and figure out what venues they can seek assistance from, whether that's the public, whether that's the government, whether that's an interest group. They then find that venue and seek a change in the policy. They then organize through protests or through an interest group or through contacting their member of Congress. They then make decisions, the lawmakers, and the government refuses to act potentially or passes that law. The policy agenda is influenced by both action and inaction. If the government decides to respond to the people, that's the direction they'll go down in the future. If they decide not to respond, it reinforces the status quo. Then in our common law system, the court may weigh in. It results in the policy being secure, expanding or curtailing liberty, and then people experience the outcome of that policy, which then may lead to another problem, or there might be another problem that happens. It just constantly happens. Government never stops. Democracy faces a dilemma. How responsive should leaders be to public opinion? Participation is obviously unequal. Affluent and educated citizens, members of the elite, express their views more often and are more listened to, which shapes policy more than the opinions of poor people. Marginalized groups may be undersampled or silenced. Sometimes majority opinion conflicts with constitutional protections or scientific expertise. Sometimes people are all like, yeah, take my rights away. And the government has to be like, no, we can't do that. And this leads to a tension between responsiveness and responsibility, deciding when to follow people and when to lead them. Look at the reading that I assigned during the presidential lecture, and we can talk about that a little bit. So let's talk about telephone surveys here a little bit, kinds of biases they have. So let's start over here. This is what people think, or this is the outcome of a poll, right? All of these opinions are taken into account. And for us to take into account those opinions, it has to be people who have answered the phone, and we have to believe that they are honest in the telephone surveys. But there's a problem. All the people who answer are not honest in those surveys. Some people lie. So really the usable data is only this big. But let's go back, actually. The real data is much smaller. We're only getting the people who pick up their phones. Really, there are a ton of people who don't pick up their phones. This is a problem with sampling. Think about it like this. If we continue to do telephone surveys, which people do still sometimes, not really, but they do, most people aren't going to pick up because it's going to say spam, or you're just not going to recognize the number on your cell phone. Most people don't have a landline anymore, so you can't geolocate where those people are. It's really difficult to get that kind of information. If you're taking a survey online, it's even harder because you have to make yourself available to take that survey. So there are massive problems with measurement error for surveys in the modern day. This is what they were talking about the 2016 election, with polls about the election results being so widely off, because Trump voters, by and large, were very apprehensive about answering these surveys and either lied on them or just didn't pick up the phone. That's why people estimated that Hillary Clinton would win the 2016 election when she did not. So, big takeaways here. In summary, public opinion and political attitudes provide the connective tissue of democratic politics. They aggregate individual preferences into collective signals, guide policymakers, and legitimize authority. Yet, they are mediated by institutions, distorted by inequality, and constantly reshaped by policy feedback. When you view this together, it allows us to evaluate when government is actually representative and when it drifts from what the public actually wants. Next time, we're going to look at psychological processes underpinning this. So we viewed kind of the massive movement here. We're going to view what happens inside people's heads when they make political decisions next time.